Welcome to part 4 of this video on the hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal axis. Okay, so we're now at the point of discussing the effects of cortisol on the body, on different tissues of the body. So there are absolutely loads of effects of the hormone cortisol, and as I said earlier, we are not going to list them all out. Instead, we're just going to focus on the two major categories of effects, and those are the effects on metabolism and the effects on the immune system. So we'll begin with the effects on metabolism. So the major effect of cortisol on metabolism is that it's going to raise fasting blood glucose level. And to understand how it's actually going to do that and how it fits into other hormones that other systems, physiological systems that you will know about for controlling blood glucose level, I want to just remind you about the major way in which blood glucose level is controlled at a constant level. So what we're going to discuss then is the metabolic effects of cortisol. Okay, so metabolism, or I will title this metabolic effects. So I'm going to begin with just a little bit of a reminder about how normal fasting blood glucose concentration is maintained. Okay, so you will probably know that the normal fasting blood glucose concentration, and by fasting I mean the blood glucose concentration when you have not just eaten a meal, so there's been a long time since your last meal. What's your blood glucose concentration then? That's what we mean by fasting blood glucose concentration. The healthy fasting blood glucose concentration is around 5 millimolar, and in the American units this is about 90 milligrams per deciliter. So people use different units for measuring blood glucose level. In England we use millimolar as the preferred unit. In the States they use milligrams per deciliter. To convert between the two, you just multiply this one by 18 to turn it into 90. So that's the conversion factor for converting between millimolar and milligrams per deciliter. But it doesn't matter. Either units that you want to use, there is a normal fasting blood glucose concentration. So let's say this is the blood here, and the normal blood glucose concentration in the blood is going to be 5 millimolar or 90 milligrams per deciliter when you are fasting. So this is the normal fasting blood glucose. Okay, now how do we actually maintain it at that? Now let's just understand why this is actually something that needs to happen. Well, remember, glucose is in the blood for a reason. It's going to be supplying tissues with energy. Peripheral tissues are going to be taking glucose continuously out of the blood and using it in metabolism. They're going to be using it in respiration. So let's just draw a little picture of this. So there are continuously tissues taking glucose out of the bloodstream and using it for respiration. So what are good examples of peripheral tissues? Well, I don't know, maybe the brain, for example. So here is an example of a peripheral tissue, the brain, like so, and here's the cerebellum. We'll see that picture again later. Or maybe the heart as well, another good example of a peripheral tissue. So let me just draw the heart. So here is the right ventricle, the right atrium, left ventricle going up there. We'll have the superior vena cava coming off here, and the aorta going up there. So that's my picture of the heart there, left ventricle there, left atrium there. I'll just colour that in red. So there's the heart in red. So these are peripheral tissues, so I'll just label them up here. These are representing the peripheral tissues which are taking glucose out of the bloodstream all the time and using it for their purposes. Okay, so I'm just trying to illustrate why maintaining blood glucose is a problem. So this is the continual force that we are working to try and stop actually altering the blood glucose here. So there are continuously the peripheral tissues which are taking glucose out of the bloodstream and using it and not putting it back in. They're destroying it. They're producing carbon dioxide from it. Again, also energy, which is obviously very important for them. So That's the problem. That's why blood glucose isn't just going to stay constant. So if we're going to have a balance, if we're going to maintain blood glucose concentration in the fasting state, so there's no glucose coming in through the intestine, if we're going to maintain blood glucose concentration, then something is going to have to be putting in the same amount of glucose into the bloodstream that the peripheral tissues are taking out. Now, in the fasting state, as I say, the intestine is not putting glucose in. So what does put the glucose into the bloodstream continuously? Well, hopefully you know the answer. It is, of course, the liver. So here is the liver, and the liver will continuously be putting glucose into the bloodstream, and this amount of glucose that it's putting into the bloodstream should match the amount of glucose that the peripheral tissues are taking out of the bloodstream, and then of course you will have a dynamic equilibrium. So I'll just colour in the yellow, the liver here, in yellow, like so. So there's our liver. Just re-straighten this back up. So this is the liver. Now, where is the liver actually getting the glucose that it's putting into the bloodstream from? Well, of course, there are two ways that the liver can get glucose. One is that it can break down glycogen molecules that it has stored within its cells. So in all of the hepatocytes, you have glucose stored in a great big polymer known as glycogen. And in the fasting state, the hepatocytes can break down the glycogen and release the glucose into the bloodstream gradually. Of course, in the fed state, when you've just eaten a meal, they then replenish their glycogen stores, so they take glucose out of the bloodstream and build it into glycogen molecules, so that when you're again in the fasting state, they can be doing this breakdown of glycogen and releasing the glucose into the bloodstream. So the process of breaking glycogen down and releasing the glucose from it is known as gluconeogenesis. Okay, so glycogen breakdown. Lysis means to break something up. Glycogen is the polymer of glucose. So just to draw a little picture here, if we have a hepatocyte, I'll have my hepatocyte here. Glycogen is a molecule that's made up of loads of glucose molecules. So just as a simple picture, I'll draw a glucose molecule as a hexagon, because roughly the sugar is a hexagon, like so. And you've got loads of these little sugar molecules of glucose joined together. So each one of these hexagons is representing a glucose molecule, then the lot of them all joined together into this string is then a glycogen polymer, and you'd have more than 4, but I don't want to have to draw more than that. So these are all glucose monomers here in a great big polymer known as glycogen. So the hepatocytes of the liver then, they can break down their glycogen polymers in the fasting state gradually and then release the glucose molecules into the bloodstream. So that's one of the ways that the hepatocytes are going to get glucose to release into the bloodstream. However, there is also another way that they can get glucose to release into the bloodstream, and this is known as gluconeogenesis. Now, what is meant by gluconeogenesis? Gluconeogenesis is the production of glucose. So glucogenesis means production of glucose from completely non-sugar forms, molecules that are not sugar. So you're making new sugar molecules from non-sugar molecules. Okay, and now what non-sugar molecules do you actually use to make the glucose then? Well, specifically you use amino acids, and I'll discuss where these amino acids are going to come from in just a moment. So hepatocytes can take amino acids out of the bloodstream, and I'm just to show this here. So when they're trying to get glucose to put into the bloodstream, they can actually take amino acids out of the bloodstream, and of course amino acids are the components of proteins. So they can take amino acids out of the bloodstream, and they can then convert these amino acids into glucose. So I'll draw an amino acid here just as this little pink thing here. They can actually use amino acids to build glucose molecules. So here is a blue hexagon, here is a glucose molecule, and this process is known as gluconeogenesis. So not only can they get glucose by breaking down glycogen, that's glycogenolysis, but they can also convert amino acids into glucose, and that's known as gluconeogenesis. Let me just re-straighten this up, and then this glucose is what they'll be putting into the bloodstream like so. Okay, so this is what's happening then during the fasting state. The peripheral tissues are continuously taking glucose out. We want to maintain a constant blood glucose concentration so that they are always able to take blood glucose out. If blood glucose concentration was to fall, then the peripheral tissues would start to have problems taking blood glucose from the blood, and then they'd starve and die. Okay, so the liver is involved then in putting the same amount of glucose into the bloodstream as the peripheral tissues are taking out, and therefore maintaining a dynamic equilibrium. Where do the liver cells get the glucose? Well, from two processes, glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Now, how do hepatocytes know that this is what they are supposed to be doing? Because the simple answer would be if hepatocytes were able to sense that somehow it was the fasting state, i.e. maybe they could sense that blood glucose wasn't very high the way it would be in the fed state when you've got loads of glucose coming into the blood from the intestine, and then they were able to adjust their behaviour accordingly. However, that's not the way it's done. Instead, there are two very important hormones which tell hepatocytes that this is what they should be doing. So in the fasting state, you will know that the two major hormones, insulin and glucagon, are in certain proportions, and it is this that communicates to the hepatocytes what they're supposed to be doing. So the major hormones that control blood glucose concentration are insulin and glucagon. And remember, it's an utter shift between the fed state and the fasting state. In the fasting state, insulin is low, but not zero, note, and glucagon is high. Whereas in the fed state, it's the opposite way around. Insulin goes high and glucagon goes low. And those two different conditions of these hormones then result in the two very different actions upon the body, which will deal with the fasting state and the fed state. Okay, so in the fasting state, insulin is going to be low and glucagon is going to be high. Now, glucagon, it activates the hepatocytes to break down glycogen and also to participate in gluconeogenesis. Insulin inhibits both of these, but insulin is very low and therefore doesn't have much of an effect, but it does have some effect. It stops the hepatocytes going crazy, and in fact in diabetes, in type 2 and type 1 diabetes, where you've got problems with insulin signaling to the hepatocytes, then you end up with far too high fasting blood glucose concentration because you don't have the brake that the insulin provides, and the glucagon then overstimulates the hepatocytes to put in too much glucose into the bloodstream, and that's what causes the fasting hyperglycemia, too high blood glucose level. So it is important to remember that the insulin is non-zero and it does provide a brake on the hepatocytes. It's important to remember that to understand why you end up with fasting hyperglycemia in diabetes. Okay, but this is the hormonal arrangement of these two really important hormones in the fasting state. Insulin is low, glucagon is high. Glucagon is telling hepatocytes to break down glycogen and to convert amino acids into glucose. Insulin provides a bit of a brake, but the glucagon signal is stronger than the insulin signal, so overall you do participate in these, but this signaling is perfect. It just makes the hepatocytes release the right amount of glucose into the bloodstream to maintain this healthy fasting blood glucose concentration. Right, so that's the normal way that the hepatocytes are being signalled to behave in the fasting state. Now, just before we talk about what cortisol is going to do to this, let's just talk about the other targets of insulin, or rather the other effects of having low insulin, and in particular this will explain where these amino acids are going to come from. So glucagon, this hormone only affects the liver. So glucagon and insulin together, they determine the activity of the liver. However, low insulin is going to affect other tissues, in particular the skeletal muscle tissue and also the adipose tissue. And I just want to mention these tissues because it's going to be important for understanding cortisol. Okay, so let me draw a little skeletal muscle then here. So here are the tendons, here's the belly of the muscle, here's another tendon. So those are the boundaries, and here's the muscle belly in red here. So when insulin is very low, that indicates that we are in the fasting state, okay? And low insulin is what drives skeletal muscle cells to break down proteins that they have within them, a process known as proteolysis, and release amino acids into the bloodstream. So skeletal muscle tissue is a store of proteins. You have a huge number of proteins, the myosin filaments, the actin filaments in skeletal muscle. It's a store of protein, a store of amino acids. Now, in the fed state, insulin will be very high, and insulin being high tells the skeletal muscle cells to not bother breaking down, so that puts a complete brake on proteolysis. When insulin is low, proteolysis starts up. So low insulin is what drives proteolysis, not high glucagon. The skeletal muscle cells are insensitive to glucagon. Glucagon only acts on the liver. It's the low insulin, the absence of a high enough insulin signal, that causes proteolysis to go up. So when you're in the fasting state, you're going to start getting a little bit of proteolysis. Now, it's only a little bit. Insulin has to go very, very low before you get massive proteolysis, and of course that's one of the problems that diabetics face, that they get muscle wasting because the insulin signal isn't high enough and is lower even than it would be in the normal fasting state, and then that drives excessive proteolysis. Okay, but this is where these amino acids are going to come from. So the skeletal muscle tissue is going to be releasing amino acids into the bloodstream, and these amino acids are then going to be used by the hepatocytes to make glucose in the process of gluconeogenesis. So here we go. I might even colour in the arrows. So the amino acids are being released into the bloodstream by the skeletal muscle tissue, and then they're being taken out of the bloodstream, which is this arrow here, by the hepatocytes and used to make glucose in gluconeogenesis. Excellent, right. Insulin being low is also going to affect the adipose tissue. So, insulin being low but not glucagon being high. Again, I'll stress, glucagon only affects the hepatocytes, not the skeletal muscle tissue or the adipocytes. So let me now draw an adipocyte here. So here is its little nucleus, and of course here is its massive great fat droplet, which will contain triacylglycerols or triglycerides. So I'll colour it in yellow here. So here's our adipocyte. So again, insulin being low is going to cause the adipocytes to start breaking down their triacylglycerols and releasing free fatty acids. So to draw a simple picture of a triacylglycerol, here is my simple cartoon. This vertical line here, now coloured in green, represents the glycerol molecule, of course, and these horizontal lines, now coloured in pink, these will represent the long-chain carboxylic acids, which are more commonly known as fatty acids. So what will happen is, in the fed state, of course, there's no need to break down triacylglycerols and release free fatty acids into the bloodstream, because you've got loads of nutrients coming in from the intestine. So high insulin in the fed state inhibits the adipocytes from breaking down their lipids, and instead encourages them to take up nutrient molecules and build new lipids. But when insulin is low during the fasting state, then that's what's going to then allow adipocytes to break down their triacylglycerols and release lipid molecules into the bloodstream. Okay, so the adipocytes are going to take part in lipolysis, the breakdown of the lipid molecules here. So what will happen is the triacylglycerols will have their ester links between the long-chain carboxylic acids and the glycerol molecule broken, and then you'll get free fatty acids, which I'll abbreviate down to FFAs, released from this process, and these will then go into the bloodstream. And what's the point of the free fatty acids? Well, of course, those can attach to albumin protein, and in fact this is another good example of what albumin carries. This is the major this is what I would quote as the major function of albumin, to transport free fatty acids around the bloodstream, but of course we know it transports loads of other things as well. But the free fatty acids that are released by adipocytes will bind to albumin proteins in the bloodstream and be carried all over the body to be used and metabolized. In particular, muscle tissues are very good at using free fatty acids for metabolic processes. So the heart absolutely loves fatty acids, and it will break them down by beta oxidation to produce acetyl coenzyme A, which can then go through the Krebs cycle and produce ATP. Well, but with the electron transport chain added on. Okay, so that is overall then what is happening. Metabolism in the fasting state, this is what is happening. The liver is maintaining blood glucose concentration. You're getting amino acids released by skeletal muscle, which is helping the liver to maintain blood glucose concentration, and alongside that you have the adipocytes releasing free fatty acids into the bloodstream as an alternative energy source for certain tissues that are capable of using them, such as the heart. Okay, now let's see how cortisol is going to affect this fasting state metabolism. Okay, so cortisol is going to lead to increases in all of this. It's going to lead to fasting hyperglycemia, at least a little bit high. It's going to raise fasting blood glucose concentration. It's going to raise the amount of amino acids in the bloodstream. It's also going to raise the amount of free fatty acids in the bloodstream. Okay, so cortisol, what are its actions? So it's going to go into the hepatocytes and it's going to increase glycogenesis and increase gluconeogenesis. So cortisol is going to encourage these two, and therefore overall that means that now the hepatocytes are going to be releasing more glucose into the bloodstream. Now what does that mean? Well, that means that you're going to get the balance distorted, because now the hepatocytes will be releasing more glucose into the bloodstream than the peripheral tissues will be taking out of the bloodstream. That means blood glucose concentration is going to go up. So this is going to raise blood glucose concentration. Now it's going to cause fasting hyperglycemia. So that's one of the results of cortisol. So fasting hyperglycemia, raising the blood glucose concentration in the fasting state. Okay, in addition, it's going to go into the skeletal muscle cells and it's going to increase their proteolysis rate. So I'll draw this as well, so it will go over here and activate proteolysis. And of course that's going to mean that we're going to get more amino acids in the bloodstream, and therefore that will help the hepatocytes to increase their gluconeogenesis rate. I mean, without more amino acids arriving, you can't raise gluconeogenesis, so this goes hand in hand with this. Okay, in addition, of course, it's going to go into the adipocytes and it's going to raise lipolysis. So if I zoom this down here, it's going to increase lipolysis here, which I'll underline in orange there, and therefore it's going to raise the free fatty acid concentration in the bloodstream. So free fatty acids in the bloodstream will be now at a higher concentration when cortisol has been released from the adrenal cortex. Okay, so those are the effects of cortisol then on metabolism. You're going to basically increase the amount of nutrients that are available for the peripheral tissues. You're going to raise blood glucose concentration, raise blood amino acid concentration, and raise free fatty acid concentration. You're going to make available more nutrients within the bloodstream, and we will see why that is. Well, actually I'll talk now about why that's potentially something you'd want to do. So we've talked about how, and we will talk in much more detail later, about how cortisol is released in response to stress. It's released as part of a circadian cycle, which we'll talk about later, but it's also released suddenly in response to stress. Now, in a stressful situation, you will want more more nutrients to be available in the bloodstream. If you've suffered infective stress or emotional stress or physical stress or any other type of stress, you're going to want more nutrients available so that your body is better able to deal with that stress. So I hope that this is starting to make sense about the effects of cortisol, but as I say, later on when we study the hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal axis in full, we will be looking at the big picture of what is the point of this hormone, why does this system exist. Okay, but there you go, that's the effect of cortisol on metabolism. So we'll have a break here, and in the next video we'll discuss the effects of cortisol on the immune system.